My fiancée secretly paid for her dream wedding using my deceased mom's jewelry. So, I turned her big day into a wake-up call she'll never forget. I, 29M, discovered 3 weeks before our wedding that my fiancé had sold my deceased mother's jewelry collection to pay for what she called upgrades to our ceremony. The woman I thought I knew had transformed our modest celebration into a $40,000 spectacle behind my back, and when I confronted her about the missing jewelry box, she looked me straight in the eye and told me she had every right to use our assets for our future. My mother passed away 2 years ago after a brutal fight with cancer. In her final weeks, she pressed that small velvet jewelry box into my hands and made me promise to give it to the woman I'd marry someday. Inside were her engagement ring, a pearl necklace my grandfather bought her in 1962, and several other pieces that held generations of family history. The monetary value was maybe $8,000, but the sentimental worth was immeasurable. I had shown the collection to my fiancé about 6 months into our relationship, explaining the promise I made to my mother. She held each piece carefully, asking about their stories, and I remember thinking how perfect it was that she understood their significance. When I proposed last year, I used my grandmother's ring from the collection, and she cried when I told her it would make my mother so happy. 3 weeks ago, I went to retrieve the jewelry box to have the pieces professionally cleaned before the wedding. The box was in our shared closet where I'd always kept it, but when I opened it, everything was gone except for a few costume jewelry pieces that weren't even my mother's. My hands shook as I searched through our entire bedroom, thinking maybe she'd moved them for safekeeping. When I asked her about it, she seemed nervous at first, then defensive. She told me she'd used them as collateral for a loan to upgrade our wedding venue, flowers, and catering. According to her, the original plans weren't good enough for the social media wedding she wanted. She'd gone behind my back to book a luxury venue, premium everything, and when the costs spiraled beyond our budget, she took my mother's jewelry to a high-end pawn shop. I asked if she planned to get them back, and she shrugged, saying we could buy new jewelry once we were married and had 2 incomes. She actually said the old pieces were dated anyway, and that we could start our own traditions. I stood there, unable to process that the woman I was about to marry had sold my mother's memory for Instagram photos. The argument that followed was devastating. She accused me of caring more about dead people than our future together. I told her she'd stolen irreplaceable family heirlooms, and she countered that I was being dramatic over old jewelry when she was trying to give us a beautiful wedding. The conversation ended with her storming out to stay with her sister. That night, I sat in our empty apartment and realized I didn't recognize the person I'd been living with. This wasn't a miscommunication or different priorities. This was someone who could violate something sacred to me and then justify it with social media aspirations. But instead of calling off the wedding immediately, something else began forming in my mind. She'd invited 150 people to witness our dream wedding. She'd created elaborate social media announcements about the luxury venue and premium everything. Her entire extended family was flying in from across the country. She'd built this fantasy celebration on the grave of my mother's memory, and I decided she could have her perfect wedding day, just not the way she expected. I spent the next week researching and planning. First, I went to the pawn shop where she'd sold the jewelry. The pieces were already gone, sold to various collectors, but I got documentation of the transaction showing she'd received $6,200 for everything. Then I contacted our wedding vendors. The venue coordinator was sympathetic when I explained that there had been a family emergency requiring us to downgrade. I canceled the luxury package she'd booked and reinstated our original, modest plan. I did the same with the caterer, florist, and photographer. Instead of premium everything, we were back to basic packages, still nice, but nothing like the spectacle she'd advertised to everyone. Then I made arrangements with a funeral home. They provided a beautiful display case, exactly like the ones used for memorial services, along with professional-grade photos of my mother and her jewelry collection. I had the documentation from the pawn shop professionally mounted, showing exactly what had been sold and for how much. My fiancée returned 3 days before the wedding, apparently having decided that I'd calmed down enough to proceed as planned. She seemed nervous when I didn't bring up the jewelry again, but I told her I wanted to focus on our future together. She relaxed, probably thinking she'd won. The morning of the wedding, I arrived at the venue early to set up my surprise. Instead of the luxury decorations she was expecting, I arranged the memorial display at the front of the ceremony space, right where our altar should have been. The photos of my mother were beautiful, surrounded by pictures of her jewelry pieces and the pawn shop documentation. A simple placard read, "In memory of the family treasures sold to fund this celebration." When she arrived and saw everything, the color drained from her face. She demanded to know what I was doing, and I calmly explained that since she'd turned our wedding into a transaction, I thought our guests should know exactly what the true cost had been. She frantically tried to remove the display while her family and friends started arriving. Her mother approached me, asking what was happening, so I explained the entire situation. I showed her the pawn shop receipts and explained how my mother's dying wish had been used to fund upgraded centerpieces and premium linens. Word spread quickly among the arriving guests. When it came time for the ceremony to begin, I stood at the memorial display instead of the altar. As our wedding party and guests gathered, I addressed everyone directly. I thanked them for coming to celebrate what should have been the beginning of my marriage, but explained that instead they were witnessing the end of my relationship with someone who valued social media perfection over family legacy. I told the complete story, my mother's final gift, the promise I'd made, and how those irreplaceable pieces had been sold without my knowledge to fund wedding upgrades. I showed everyone the documentation and explained that while they were welcome to stay and enjoy the reception we'd already paid for, there would be no wedding today. Her family was mortified. Several of her aunts approached me afterwards, apologizing and saying they'd had no idea. Her grandmother actually hugged me and said she was ashamed of what had been done to my mother's memory. Even some of her friends seemed shocked, admitting they'd thought the lavish wedding seemed out of character for us financially. My ex-fiancée spent the day in the bridal suite, alternately crying and screaming at anyone who tried to talk to her. Her sister kept trying to convince people that I was being unreasonable, but the pawn shop documentation was pretty damning evidence. Her maid of honor actually came up to me and said she'd tried to warn her that taking the jewelry was wrong, but she'd been brushed off. The reception became something surreal. Half the guests left immediately, but others stayed, and it turned into an odd support gathering. People shared stories about my mother, who many of them had known and loved. Several family friends mentioned how proud she would have been to see me stand up for her memory. Update 1. The aftermath has been interesting, to say the least. In the 2 weeks since the wedding that wasn't, I've learned a lot about who my ex-fiancée really was and how many red flags I'd apparently missed. Her sister called me a few days later, furious about the public humiliation and demanding I pay for the wedding expenses since I was the one who ruined everything. I reminded her that her sister had already sold $6,200 worth of my inheritance to cover her upgrades, and that I'd actually saved money by downgrading back to our original plans. The conversation ended with her threatening to sue me for emotional damages, which my lawyer friend found hilarious. More interesting were the conversations with her family members who reached out separately. Her grandmother called to apologize again and mentioned that this wasn't the first time she'd taken things that didn't belong to her. Apparently, she'd borrowed her grandmother's pearl earrings for a sorority formal in college and conveniently forgot to return them. Her cousin admitted that she'd always been materialistic and status-obsessed, but the family had hoped marriage would settle her down. I also discovered she'd been lying about other things. Remember how she'd justified the wedding upgrades as being for social media? Turns out she'd already been planning to monetize our wedding content through a blog and Instagram partnership deal she'd set up without telling me. She'd essentially turned our marriage into a business venture, using my mother's jewelry as startup capital. The most shocking revelation came from her former college roommate, who reached out through mutual friends. She told me that during their senior year, my ex-fiancé had stolen her grandmother's class ring and sold it to pay for spring break. When confronted, she denied it completely and convinced everyone that the roommate had lost it herself. The roommate had never been able to prove it, but seeing my wedding story brought all those memories back. Meanwhile, my ex-fiancée has been posting on social media about toxic relationships and narcissistic abuse, painting herself as the victim of my controlling behavior. She's telling people I humiliated her because I couldn't handle her success and ambition. Some of her friends are buying this narrative, but anyone who knows the actual story isn't impressed. Her posts about being a survivor of emotional abuse are particularly galling, considering she violated the memory of my deceased mother for wedding upgrades. But I've decided not to engage publicly. The people who matter know what really happened, and I have documentation proving everything. Update 2. A month after the incident, I got a call that changed everything. The pawn shop owner contacted me to say that one of the jewelry collectors who'd purchased my mother's pieces had seen the story circulating on social media and wanted to return them. Apparently, several people had been sharing posts about what happened, and this collector recognized the description of the pearl necklace. When I met him, he explained that he specialized in vintage estate jewelry and had immediately recognized the quality and craftsmanship of my mother's pieces. He'd actually been troubled by the pawn shop transaction, since the person selling them seemed to know nothing about their history or significance. When he saw my story, he knew he had to act. Not only did he return the pearl necklace without accepting any payment, but he'd tracked down 2 other pieces through his collector network. One dealer in the next state had the engagement ring and agreed to sell it back to me at cost. Another collector had 2 of the smaller pieces and simply returned them after hearing the story. I broke down crying when I held my mother's ring again. The collector who'd started this chain of returns stayed with me for a while, sharing stories about estate jewelry and family heirlooms. He told me he'd started collecting because his own grandmother's jewelry had been lost when his family fled Europe during World War II. He understood exactly what these pieces meant beyond their monetary value. I still haven't recovered everything, but having the most important pieces back feels like getting a part of my mother back. I had them professionally cleaned and appraised, and they're now in a safety deposit box where only I have access. The jewelry recovery story somehow made it onto local news, and then got picked up by a few national outlets as a feel-good follow-up to the original wedding drama. Several other collectors reached out offering to help track down the remaining pieces, and 2 more have been located, though I'm still negotiating to get them back. My ex-fiancée was not pleased about the positive attention I was receiving. She posted a long social media rant about how I was exploiting her trauma for sympathy and media attention. She claimed the jewelry story was exaggerated and that she'd only borrowed the pieces temporarily. The problem with this narrative is that I have the pawn shop's security footage showing her completing a permanent sale, which I'd obtained for potential legal proceedings. Update 3. 6 weeks later, karma delivered its final blow in a way I never could have orchestrated. My ex-fiancée's social media empire came crashing down when several of her sponsored content deals fell through after brands discovered the jewelry theft story. Apparently, her Instagram partnership for wedding content wasn't just dependent on having a successful wedding. It required her to maintain a certain image of authenticity and family values. When the companies learned she'd stolen family heirlooms to fund her content creation, they terminated their contracts and demanded refunds on advance payments they'd made. Her blog about budget-friendly luxury weddings became impossible to maintain once people realized her budget tips had involved selling someone else's family treasures. The lifestyle brand that had been courting her for a longer partnership dropped her completely, citing brand image concerns. But the real justice came when her sister's threat about suing me backfired spectacularly. They actually did consult with a lawyer about pursuing me for emotional damages and defamation. The lawyer took one look at the documentation I had, the pawn shop receipts, security footage, and communications where she admitted to taking the jewelry, and explained that not only did they have no case, but I could potentially sue her for theft and conversion. The lawyer apparently told them that my actions at the wedding, while dramatic, were completely legal since I was only sharing truthful information about my own property being stolen. He warned them that pursuing legal action would likely result in me countersuing and potentially having her face criminal charges for theft. This reality check seemed to finally penetrate her delusions about being the victim. Her sister called me one last time, no longer threatening lawsuits, but asking if there was any way to resolve this quietly and whether I would consider not pursuing legal action if they helped recover more of the jewelry. I told her I had no intention of pursuing legal action as long as she stayed out of my life completely, but that I also wouldn't stop working with collectors to recover my mother's pieces. The conversation was civil, and I think they finally understood that I hadn't been vindictive. I'd simply been protecting my mother's memory and my own rights. 3 months later, I've recovered about 80% of the jewelry collection. 2 pieces are still missing, but I've made peace with the possibility that they're gone forever. The important thing is that the majority of my mother's legacy has been restored, and I've learned to trust my instincts about people's character. I've started dating again, cautiously, but I'm in no rush. The woman I eventually marry will understand that family history and memories aren't negotiable assets. She'll appreciate that my mother's jewelry represents love, commitment, and legacy, not social media opportunities or wedding upgrades. The memorial display from the wedding is now set up in my living room, but instead of pawn shop receipts, it shows photos of the recovered pieces and thank you notes from the collectors who helped return them. It's become a celebration of human decency and the power of community, rather than a monument to betrayal. Sometimes people ask if I regret the dramatic way I handled the wedding situation. My answer is always the same. I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret defending my mother's memory. Some boundaries can't be crossed without consequences, and some betrayals can't be quietly forgiven. The woman who sold my mother's jewelry to fund her Instagram fantasy learned that actions have consequences. I learned that sometimes the most painful experiences lead to the most important discoveries about people's true character. And my mother's legacy learned that love and memory are worth fighting for, no matter how dramatic the battle becomes.